Poppies is a poem by the English poet Jane Weir, first published in 2005. Jane Weir is a writer and a dressmaker who grew up in Manchester where she was born. Poppies is Weir's response to a commission for war poems asked for by the poet laureate at the time, Carol Ann Duffy. And in her poem, Weir said that she tried to encapsulate that pain and loss felt by many during the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan at the time. Jane moved to Northern Ireland during the Troubles of the 1980s, so you could say that she has experienced conflict herself in quite a close and personal way. Jane herself is a mother of 2 sons, so although she is not the mother in the poem, perhaps some of that maternal instinct and imagery is something that we can see reflected throughout. Poppies is a poem for all parents, their children, and the bond that holds them. It's also the first and only explicitly female voice in your power and conflict cluster. Weir uses an array of social, historical, political, and emotional preoccupations, often trying to use a diverse range of scenarios, situations, and voices to really get the meaning of her messages across to her readers. A poppy is the enduring symbol of remembrance of the First World War. It's strongly linked with Armistice Day, but the poppy's origin as a popular symbol of remembrance lies in the landscapes of the First World War. In a similar way to the poem Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, Jane Weir here is interested in the personal experience of those affected by conflict. In this case, it's the very close family of those that are left behind. Weir felt, as the mother of 2 teenage boys, that speaking from a mother's perspective about loss would be most powerful. She has said since that she was thinking specifically of Susan Owen, the mother of the World War I poet Wilfred Owen, when writing this poem. It's important to think about what we've spoken through so far and try to summarise what we think the poem is about before we look at it line by line. The speaker in Poppies is grieving at the loss of a child. We can assume that the child has died in war, and the poem centres around the mother's inability to cope with such a sad loss. The poem can also be read as an extended metaphor to the more general feeling of anxiety that all parents face as their children prepare to leave home. Now let's remind ourselves of the poem itself. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play at being Eskimos, like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled blackthorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcement of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. We're now going to explore the poem in a lot more detail, but please do remember that this is not the only interpretation or analysis of this poem or of the lines, the phrases and the words that Weir has used. There is so much more you can say. But this is just to get you started and to get you thinking. Though the poem never explicitly states that it's about war, it is implied through this Armistice Sunday. It's seemingly a combination of Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday, both of which commemorate the end of World War I. Here, through the reference to individual war graves, Jane Weir reminds us that this poem is about the experience of the individual. It's very much an individual experience of suffering and loss. Before you left is in reference to something she's remembering. There's lots of memory and remembrance throughout this poem. The lapel and reference here could be to a uniform worn by a soldier or perhaps a child when going to school. The ambiguity helps ground the universal experience being described. Essentially, the poet makes the experience of sending a child to war feel all the more recognisable by comparing it to sending a child to school. Look closely at the next part of the line. One way of reading these lines is that the mother is hinting at the events which led to her son's death, an event which perhaps is too painful to say outright. The word spasms provokes an image of unnatural, painful, distressing deaths or injury. The red is a metaphor of the bloodshed of war, and paper implies the disposability and weakness which Weir relates to the loss of life on the battlefield. The link between the imperfections of the poppy and the hope it symbolises signify a sense of broken hope from the narrator, likely to be that for her son's safety. The wonderful image of the mother brushing hairs off of her son's blazer shows the care and pride she has for her child. The bandage could be metaphorically representative of a war injury. In the image of her rounding up the cat hairs and brushing them off of her son, Weir presents a nostalgic tone. The mother is longing for her son and for the past. Look at the use of sibilants in this next line. It reiterates how soft, gentle and careful she is with her son. He is so precious to her, perhaps highlighting her later regret at letting him leave. The mother is being brave here, trying not to show her fear or anxiety on her face as she steels the softening of it. Notice how there's quite a lot of resistance in this poem. There's a resistance here to rub noses in fear of acting too childish to her grown-up son. There's a resistance in the urge to break down when he leaves, and a resistance to accept the grief until the final lines of the poem. There are irregular moments of internal rhyme and rhyme throughout. The form and structure of this poem has momentary lapses, similar to the momentary lapses in bravery from the mother, trying hard not to show her true emotions. Again, we start with a resistance here, but this time a resistance to run her fingers through the gelled blackthorns of her son's hair. The gelled hair could be in reference to her son being a teenager, as teenagers typically gel their hair. This could be another way of Weir presenting the child's childhood innocence before being sent to his death. Think carefully here about why Weir may have used the image of blackthorns to describe his hair. Blackthorns could be representative of the shape of the gelled spikes in his hair. They could be representative of the barbed wire used in war, or they could also be read as biblical, metaphorically likening his hair to the crown of thorns worn by Christ, another reference to the sacrifice of a son. The mother's real bravery in holding it together is shown here. We get the real raw emotion and pain through the metaphor of flattening, rolling and turning into felt, which convey the mindset of the mother, someone overwhelmed by grief but trying to stay strong. On a deeper level, these could also represent the images of warfare. The idea that her words are physically slowly melting could represent her lack of control over the situation, mixed with the pain, grief and suffering she feels towards her son's death. Take note here of the use of caesura and enjambment. It's irregular. Arguably, this is chaotic and unpredictable, further highlighting the grief and emotions as something out of the mother's control. After this metaphor of being flattened, rolled and turned into felt, we then get the reassuring "I was brave." For her, it was brave to watch her child go to war, and for parents, it's brave to watch their children grow up. The door here would have been her safety net. Metaphorically, it acts as a threshold between the world of domestic living the boy has experienced and the battlefields he is about to face. The door is safety. It keeps him in her protection. She cannot control what happens in the wider world. It's really powerful using the treasure chest to describe how the world is overflowing. Treasure connotes his naive perception of newfound freedom and his childlike excitement in discovering it. It also suggests the rich delights in the world unknown. If read figuratively, the child's enthusiasm represents the patriotic fervour that young soldiers bring to the battle. And then simply, a split second and you are away, intoxicated. It's almost like a climax to the emotional roller coaster that we've been through previously as she watches her son walk away. The reference to split second could be the speed a child grows into an adult. It could also be representative of the child's death in war and the tragic and quick loss of life. Think carefully about that word intoxicated used here to describe the son going to war. Does it connote the irrationalism, the carelessness, or the naivety of those sent off to their deaths? This really is an interesting poem, and Weir really encapsulates that pain and suffering felt by the mother as she struggles to adapt to domesticated lifestyle after losing her son at war. It's quite powerful to watch the mother go on her journey from someone who is struggling at the beginning to someone who remembers the happy times they spent growing up, and then, as we'll see in the last few lines of this poem, someone who finally accepts her son's death. We could read after you'd gone as regret, because it was only after he'd gone that the bird was released from the cage. We might think that the releasing of the caged birds represents the freedom a child has when leaving their parents, perhaps in reference to the quote, "fly the nest." It could also be a metaphor for the mother's acceptance of his death, almost bringing her a sense of peace once again. Let's think also about the cage and what that could represent. Perhaps it signifies the protection and restrictions of a child's domestic life. Another interpretation of this metaphor is that the mother is releasing her emotions which she has bottled up as though they were caged. Is the cage another door that needed throwing open? Weir really presents the acceptance here. In Later, a Single Dove, we get the symbol of peace and new life. The single dove is another reminder of the individual story of the soldier. This beautiful image of the mother running her fingers and skirting the churchyard walls is quite childish and playful. Perhaps she's remembering the past and reminding herself of her happiness. But Weir pulls us back in and reminds us of the mother's grief in her exposure to the cold, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. This is a metaphor for the mother's vulnerability before she's confronted by her son's grave. The dressmaking metaphor of tucks, darts and pleats also add to this fear and anxiety. Think about how your stomach is almost in knots when you feel sick or nervous. On reaching the top of the hill is almost climactic. Maybe her grief has reached its peak and now it's just a slow descent as she starts to find a new normality without her child. The idea of her tracing the inscription with her finger paints a very peaceful and nostalgic image of the mother remembering her child, although sadly this is all that's left of him. His identity and sense of self is now but a name on a grave. And what a humbling final sentence. The dove pulled freely against the sky. The dove could be a metaphor for her son as he's flying off into heaven. And the description of this dove being an ornamental stitch just emphasises the beauty as it flies higher into the sky. The mother has finally accepted the loss of her son, yet she's still wishful and listening carefully, hoping to hear his playground voice catching on the wind. We're now going to think about the big ideas of the poem. Remember that when you compare poems, you're comparing big ideas. You're not comparing poems line by line, and you're not comparing poetic devices. Also remember that there are so many more points that you can come up with yourself, but here are just a few to get you started. Weir provides a powerful narrative based around the pain and suffering of the individual. Weir conveys the painful psychological and physical effects of war. Weir suggests the power of our memory and how it can bring us momentary comfort or pain and suffering. Weir highlights the pain and suffering of loss. Weir portrays the fragility of life and the helplessness a parent feels when a child leaves home. Start thinking about how you might compare Poppies to one of your other poems from the Power and Conflict cluster. Does Ted Hughes, for example, provide a powerful narrative based around the pain and suffering of the individual in Bayonet Charge? Does Carol Ann Duffy present the painful psychological or physical effects of war in War Photographer? You get the idea. I really hope you've enjoyed that, and I do hope that you go away and have a think about the poem and Jane Weir in a lot more detail. Thank you for listening for today, and do check out some of the other videos covering the other poems in your Power and Conflict cluster.